Cher walked into the audience. Not toward the front rows, not toward the cameras, deep into the audience, past the third row and the fourth, past the people who had leaned forward in their seats, and past the people who had risen halfway without knowing they were rising, all the way to the 11th row, where a woman of about 80 sat very still, with both hands folded in her lap, and a photograph pressed against her chest, the way you press something against your chest when you are not sure whether to show it or keep it forever. Cher stopped in front of her. She did not speak immediately. She stood in the aisle of the Tonight Show studio in front of this woman and looked at her the way you look at someone you are trying to reconcile with a memory, measuring the distance between then and now, finding the through line, the thing that time cannot reach. Then her hand came out, and she touched the woman's face, one palm against one cheek. Gently, the way you touch a face when words have not yet arrived, and you need the hands to do what language cannot. Jimmy Fallon had not moved from behind his desk. He was standing with both hands braced on the surface, leaning forward, his mouth slightly open, his eyes scanning from Cher in the 11th row to the photograph the woman was still pressing against her chest, and back again. Confusion transitioning to disbelief, transitioning to recognition, traveling across his face in real time. A three-stage journey that 300 people were watching happen to him the same way it was happening to them. He tried to speak. He stopped. He tried again. Nothing came. It was a Monday night taping. June 2017. The Tonight Show. Cher was the guest, 71 years old, arriving in the particular way she had always arrived everywhere, fully, without apology, as if she had invented the room and was graciously allowing everyone else to use it. The audience had assembled in the specific state of readiness that only certain performers produce in a crowd. Not just excitement, something older and more personal than excitement. The feeling of being in the presence of something that has been part of your life for so long, it has become indistinguishable from the life itself. She had walked onto that stage, and the audience had given her a standing ovation that lasted long enough to become its own event. She had waved it down. She had sat across from Jimmy, and the conversation had been funny and sharp and warm, ranging across 50 years of a life lived more publicly than almost any life has ever been lived. Everything was right. And then someone in the audience held up a photograph. Not loudly, not urgently. Simply raised it above their head with both hands, the way you raise something when you need it to be seen across a distance, in the way of someone who has been building the courage to do this for a long time, and has decided that the moment is now or never. An old photograph, black and white, slightly overexposed the way photographs from that era are overexposed. Two people standing in front of something that looked like a marquee, arms around each other, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Cher stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her eyes found the photograph from the stage the way eyes find something they recognize before the mind has completed the work of recognition. The body knowing first, going still first. The hands in her lap going quiet before her face had finished understanding what it was seeing. She stood up from her chair. She walked to the edge of the stage. She looked at the photograph for a long moment from that distance, 10 rows away, across the heads of 300 people. Then she came down the stairs, and she walked into the audience, and she did not stop until she was standing in front of the woman in the 11th row who was pressing the photograph against her chest. Jimmy Fallon put both hands on his desk and did not move. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1961. Cher was not always Cher. She was not always the singular, irreducible fact of a name that needed nothing beside it. Not a last name, not a qualifier. just the one word that had come to mean something specific in the shared vocabulary of 5 decades of popular culture. In the spring of 1961, she was 15 years old, born Sherilyn Sarkeesian, living in a succession of places that her mother's life required her to live in. A child who had moved enough times to understand that home was not a location, but a quality of attention, and who had found that quality of attention in almost exactly one place: music. Not performing it yet. Just music. Just the way sound organized itself into something that felt like a shape you could live inside when the outside was uncertain. She was living in Los Angeles that spring, going to a high school where she did not quite fit and had decided not to try to, spending her afternoons in the way uncommitted 15-year-olds spend afternoons in cities, drifting, looking for the thing that would make the city make sense. She was small and dark-haired, and certain about very little, except that the version of her life that currently existed was not the version that was supposed to exist, and that the correct version was somewhere nearby, waiting. She found it, or part of it, in a record shop on Melrose Avenue called Landry's, which was owned and operated by a man named Frank Landry, who was 60 years old, and who had opened the shop in 1948 with money he had saved working a shipping dock, and who had, in the intervening 13 years, created one of the most particular and beloved small establishments in that part of Los Angeles. It was not a large shop. It had room for perhaps 8 people comfortably, 12 uncomfortably, and it smelled like cardboard sleeves and the specific dusty warmth of a room that has housed music for a long time. Frank Landry knew every record in that shop. He knew the label, the year, the session musicians, the story behind the recording. He talked about music the way people talk about something they have spent their whole life trying to understand, and have made enough peace with the incompleteness of their understanding to find it a pleasure rather than a frustration. Cher began coming in on Tuesdays, then Tuesdays and Thursdays, then most days after school, staying until Frank said it was time to close, sitting on an overturned milk crate near the back of the shop with a record sleeve in her hands while Frank put things on the turntable and talked about them. He never talked at her. He talked alongside her, the way a person talks when they are thinking out loud in the presence of someone they trust to follow the thinking. He played her things she had not heard. Billie Holiday, Charles Mingus, early Ray Charles. A particular recording of Edith Piaf that he said had been made in a studio in Paris in 1953, and that, he believed, contained more truth per minute than almost any other recording he had ever encountered. He played it and did not explain it, and let her listen. She listened to that recording 4 times that afternoon without speaking. Frank Landry had a daughter named Rosie, who was 18 and who worked in the shop on Saturdays, and who had been watching this quiet, certain 15-year-old come in and plant herself on the milk crate for several weeks before she sat down beside her one Thursday afternoon and introduced herself. Rosie Landry was 3 years older than Cher and roughly 1,000 years more confident about it. She was the kind of person who occupied space decisively, who laughed loudly without checking whether it was appropriate, who said the things she was thinking while other people were still deciding whether to think it. She and Cher should not have been natural companions. They were natural companions immediately. They spent that Thursday afternoon in the back of the shop while Frank worked the front, playing records and arguing about them, which is to say talking about music in the most honest way available. Rosie had opinions that were completely formed and completely open to revision, which is the rarest possible combination. Cher had opinions that were half-formed and absolute, which is less rare, but, Rosie told her that afternoon, was a starting point. She said, "You know what you feel. You just don't know yet why you feel it. That's the whole project. The why. They were close for 2 years, the particular closeness of young women who find each other at the exact moment when the self is still being assembled, and who participate, without quite knowing it, in each other's construction. They went to shows together when they could afford the tickets. They stood in lines for things. They argued and laughed and sat in silence in the back of the shop while music played, and Frank moved among his records like a man in a library he had built himself. Cher sang sometimes, back there on the milk crate, without meaning to, just harmonizing under her breath with whatever was on the turntable. And Rosie listened, without commenting, because she understood. Even then, that commenting would disturb something that needed to be left undisturbed. In the summer of 1963, Cher met a young man named Sonny Bono at a coffee shop on Hollywood Boulevard, and the version of her life that was supposed to exist began arriving in large, overwhelming pieces. The music became public. The public became enormous. The enormousness became everything. She and Rosie stayed close for a while, the way people stay close while the current is still slow enough to swim against. Then the current became what it became, and the distance grew the way distance grows, not through intention, but through the simple arithmetic of lives moving at different speeds. Rosie Landry married in 1967. She moved to the Bay Area with her husband, a quiet, careful man named Dennis, who worked in municipal planning and who loved her with the particular devotion of someone who understands they have been given more than they expected. She had 3 children. She helped her father when his health declined, traveling back to Los Angeles on weekends until he passed in 1975, closing the shop herself on the last day, putting the key in her pocket. Standing in the empty room that smelled like cardboard and dusty warmth for a long time before she turned off the light. She kept a box of records from the shop. Not all of them, just the ones Frank had played on particular occasions. The ones that carried a story. The PF recording was in the box. She had followed Cher's life from the Bay Area, the way you follow the life of someone who was once close to you, and who has moved into a world so different from your own that the following is its own particular kind of relationship, conducted entirely at a distance. Through screens and newspapers, and the occasional song coming from a car radio on a summer afternoon that makes you pull over for a moment, because something about the voice goes straight through you. She was not bitter about the distance. She had understood, even while it was happening, that some friendships are complete in themselves, regardless of their length. That what she and Cher had built in the back of that shop on Melrose Avenue in 1961 and 1962 was a finished thing, whole and intact. Not a fragment of something larger that had been interrupted. Her daughter had found the photograph in a shoebox in 2016, sorting through Rosie's closet while Rosie recovered from a surgery that had gone harder than expected. The photograph showed 2 girls standing in front of the marquee of a music venue in Hollywood, arms around each other, laughing at something outside the frame. On the back, in Rosie's young handwriting, "Me and Cher, October 1962, before the Wynn Stewart show." Her daughter had held the photograph for a long time. She had shown it to her mother. Rosie had held it for a long time. She said, "I haven't seen this in 40 years." Her daughter had written to the Tonight Show in the spring of 2017. She had explained, carefully and without exaggeration, who her mother was and what she had meant to a 15-year-old girl on a milk crate in a record shop on Melrose Avenue, and how her mother's health had made this window of travel narrow and uncertain. The show had arranged tickets and accessible transport and a seat in the 11th row. Rosie had not been told who the guest was. She had been told only that she had been selected as part of a viewer appreciation program and that she should come on Monday. Her daughter had placed the photograph in her hands in the car on the way to the studio. She said, Bring it. Just in case. Rosie had held it in her lap through the first 40 minutes of the taping, looking at it occasionally, looking at the stage, deciding. Then, she had raised it above her head with both hands, the way you raise something when you have decided that the moment is now or never, and a pair of 71-year-old eyes had found it from the stage across the heads of 300 people and gone completely still. Behind the scenes, no one had arranged what happened next. The producer in the wing had not moved. The director in the control room had not cut. The stage manager had simply stepped back from the monitor and let the cameras find what they needed to find, understanding that there was nothing here to manage, only something to witness. Now, in the present, Cher was standing in the 11th row of the Tonight Show studio, with one palm against Rosie Landry's cheek, and Rosie was looking up at her with the photograph still pressed against her chest, and neither of them was speaking, and 300 people were standing without having decided to stand. Cher said, quietly enough that the microphone on her lapel almost didn't catch it, "You still have the Piaf record." It was not a question. She said it the way you say something you already know is true and need to say aloud anyway, for the weight of it, for the reality of it. Rosie said, "It's in a box at home with the others. I play it sometimes. I still can't explain why it does what it does." Cher said, "Your father said it contained more truth per minute than anything he'd ever heard." Rosie said, "You remembered that?" Cher said, "I remembered everything about that room." Rosie lowered the photograph from her chest. She held it out. Cher took it and looked at it for a long moment, the two girls in front of the marquee, arms around each other, laughing at something that existed only in October 1962, and in whatever part of memory keeps the things that happened before the life became the life. Her thumb moved across the surface of the photograph once, slowly. But this is the moment no one in that studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Cher reached into the inside of her jacket and produced a record sleeve. Old, the cardboard worn soft at the corners, the edges beveled by decades of handling. She held it out to Rosie without speaking. Rosie looked at it. Her hands came up and took it carefully, the way you take something that has been kept a long time. She turned it over. She looked at the label visible through the sleeve's opening, the particular label, the particular year. The recording made in Paris in 1953. She looked up at Cher. She said, "Where did you get this?" Cher said, "I went back to the shop after your father closed it, before the building changed hands. I knocked on the door, and a man let me in, and I found it in a box in the back with records that hadn't sold. I paid him what he asked. I have had it for 42 years. Rosie Landry's hands were shaking around the record sleeve. She said, "Why didn't you send it to me?" Cher said, "I didn't know how to explain why I had it. I didn't know how to explain what those afternoons meant without explaining everything, and I didn't know how to explain everything without it sounding like something it wasn't. It was just a record shop. Except it wasn't." She sat down in the empty seat beside Rosie, in the 11th row, in the audience, in front of 300 people who had forgotten they were an audience. She sat the way you sit beside someone when you have been carrying something for 42 years and have finally found the right room to set it down in. Rosie held the record sleeve in both hands. She said, "He would have been so happy. He would have loved knowing you went back." Cher said, "He taught me how to listen. I don't know who I'd become without that room." Jimmy Fallon had come around from behind his desk. He was standing at the edge of the stage, not descending, giving the distance its proper space, one hand over his mouth and the other hanging at his side, his eyes full and unmanaged and entirely genuine. The band had not moved. The director had not cut. Questlove's hands were resting in his lap, and his head was bowed slightly, listening, the way musicians bow their heads when something is happening with sound that deserves that particular kind of attention. Then someone in the front row began to applaud. Not enthusiastically, not as a performance of appreciation. Slowly, the way a single person applauds when they cannot contain a feeling, and clapping is the only physical action available. And then the person beside them, and then the row behind. And then all 300 of them, building from nothing into something that rose through the rigging and came back down and filled the studio until Cher and Rosie were sitting in the center of it, in the 11th row, the record sleeve between them, not performing anything for anyone. Rosie Landry passed away in January 2019, 18 months after the taping, at home in the Bay Area, with her daughter beside her and the box of records on the shelf in the corner of the room where she could see it from the bed. The Piaf record was on top. Her daughter had placed it there in the autumn when the window had begun to narrow, so that it would be the first thing Rosie saw when she looked at the box. Rosie had looked at it every morning. She had said once, in the particular clarity that sometimes arrives near the end, "I spent my whole life trying to understand why that recording does what it does." I think the answer is that it doesn't explain itself. It just tells the truth and lets you do what you need to do with it. The record shop on Melrose Avenue is a clothing boutique now. The building was renovated in 1981, and the smell of cardboard and dusty warmth is long gone, and there is no milk crate, and there is no turntable. But there is, in a storage unit in the Bay Area, a box of records that Frank Landry played on particular occasions, and among them a recording made in Paris in 1953 that contains, per his careful and lifelong assessment, more truth per minute than almost anything else ever committed to vinyl. His granddaughter has the box now. She is 23 years old. She has not yet listened to the Piaf recording all the way through. She is waiting until she is ready. She understands, without being told, that some recordings ask something of the listener, and that the correct approach is not to arrive at them casually, but to arrive prepared to be changed. Some rooms you only find once. Some afternoons in the back of a record shop on a Tuesday in 1961 with music playing and no plan and nowhere else to be. Those afternoons do not repeat. They simply live inside everything that comes after, patient and permanent. The foundation beneath all the noise of the life that follows. Waiting to be named in the 11th row of a television studio on a Monday night in June, when a woman holds up a photograph and 56 years collapse into a single palm against a single cheek, and two women sit down together in the audience and let the music play.